Pine Tree Pulse. From the county to down East Maine. From Casco Bay to Mount Katahdin. We keep our fingers on the pulse of what's happening in Maine and across the nation. Brought to you by the Maine Policy Institute. Free markets, free people. Pine Tree Pulse begins now.
Well, we're very pleased to welcome State Senator Rick Bennett onto the Pine Tree Pulse today for yet another gubernatorial conversation. Rick is running as an independent for governor of Maine in 2026, one of, I don't know, I keep making this joke, but like 20 or 30 candidates right at this point? It's quite a few.
Yeah. There's plenty of candidates, and that's good.
And that's just in your race. We're not even talking about U.S. Senate or...
People will have plenty of choices. Most of them will be determined in the primaries, of course. But yeah, there are plenty of people making themselves available, which is a good thing for our democracy.
Well, we appreciate you being here and having a conversation with us about why you're running and what you plan to do if you're governor and all that fun stuff along the way.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for the
invitation. Pleasure. You don't remember this, I am certain, but you and I, of course, have known each other for a very long time. I first met you back in, I believe it was 2001. That was the year you were Senate president, if I'm not mistaken.
That's correct. Good memory.
I was in college at the University of Maine at the time, and you had invited our student government up to do like a viewing of the proceedings that day in the state legislature. So I had an opportunity to come up and shake your hand and meet you as you gavelled down somebody, and it was actually a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it, but I have no doubt you don't remember that. But
am I responsible for you, Matt? Because that would be a good thing to do.
Yeah, but that actually sort of does kind of dovetail into my first question for you, which is that you have been sort of in and out of the Maine political scene for quite some time. Obviously, you had almost two careers, really, if you think about it. When you were originally in the legislature, they kind of took a step aside for quite a while, then re-entered the fray, in party politics, being the chair of the Maine Republican Party, returning back to the legislature, etc. So I guess my first one is a very general question for you, which is, what did you learn over all that time? I mean, you've seen a lot.
I have.
From Governor King all the way to now.
Well, actually back to Jock McKernan, because I was first elected to the Maine House in 1990. And my ordeal by fire was that session, which they call the session from hell, which is when we had the big workers' comp imbroglio, and there was just the state government got shut down. And it was just a terrible time. And, John Martin was Speaker of the House, who was a lightning rod, and Charlie Prey was President of the Senate. And Jock McKernan had just won re-election as Maine's governor, and there was a bunch of budgetary issues, workers' comp problems. And
that was a particularly difficult period for Maine's budget, as I recall, too.
It was very difficult, very challenging. There were a lot of gimmicks involved with like payroll pushes and, mandatory days off for state employees, and just like a lot of funny accounting, around just trying to bridge over to get to a better place. You know what? And so I go back to that, and then, I what I've seen, to answer your question, is that leadership matters, that having the right people in the places for the moment is really critical, and having people of goodwill that will kind of look past the politics occasionally and dive into the substance of the issues and try to actually solve problems for people is really critical. And I think, I did that later on in that part of my career when I was president of the Senate. We had a tied Senate. We had 17 Republicans, 17 Democrats, and one independent. And a lot of people thought we would fail. But I had a relationship with Mike Michaud, who was the head of the Democratic caucus. I was the head of the Republican caucus at the time. And I said, this is an intentionality. We can either intend for this to work, or we can intend for all the naysayers to be correct. And so we actually created a power sharing agreement.
I still can't to this day believe that happened.
Yeah. And it actually worked. And it was based on transparency, sharing information, working together, giving each other maybe the benefit of the doubt, all of which is in short supply these days. And so, I had that experience, left the legislature, stayed politically active, as you noted, but focused on a business career, raising our two kids, my wife of 35 years in a few days. Karen and I raised Abby and Nathaniel. And then in 2020, I just felt like we need to find a way back from the precipice, which I think really threatens our whole republic, of just some of these challenges baked into the political system. And I concluded reluctantly that party politics and parties have become a large part of the problem. They're not really part of the solution. And I started to lean back into the notion of, let's find a leadership modality where people can actually find common ground and work from the areas where they agree, rather than just keep the fight alive, focusing performatively on those areas where we disagree. But the rewards in politics these days seem skewed toward keeping people fighting with each other rather than finding common ground and having a conversation. And that's the really frustrating thing, is that sometimes the conversation isn't even being had. It's like, and I credit your organization and you particularly of keeping the conversation going, being policy focused and engaging with people that may have differing views. That is missing increasingly from the State House and the way policymaking is done in Augusta.
You mentioned when you were starting to detail your career a little bit, sort of the old days of John Martin and Jock McKernan fighting with each other. You have to be old enough to remember that. And I barely am, but I do remember it being particularly bitter.
Yeah.
And I'm curious your thoughts on the divisiveness today and the fights you see happen in the legislature. I mean, there's shutdown threats and stuff that happens every year too. Now compared to then, I mean, you and I are speaking less than 24 hours after you guys just had the State of the State address, and that sort of devolved. I mean, you had people walking out, you had some pretty strong statements after the fact, somebody shouting in the middle of the actual
Several
speech.
people shouting in the middle of the speech. Yeah.
And you also had, I think, a governor who was particularly partisan and political in her speech as well.
Yes.
So how does that compare to those good old days? I mean, is it significantly worse in your mind? Or is it
there were moments
different side of the same coin?
I wouldn't call them the good old days, because I mean, any student of history, as I know you are, knows that we've been through a lot. Every generation, or every 30, 40 years, we have a real set of tensions that develop in our democracy. And I think it's partly because these fault lines appear after people, settle in, and then things are masked over, and we need to recognize that there's some things that need to be dealt with. And sometimes the political system is the last to recognize that. So, but I think that what different from the days of Jock McKernan and John Martin was that they were sort of a passing issue. And now I see it's more baked in.
It's like fundamental
to the political structure. And as you know, there are people in politics, campaign consultants and dark money and big funders who really the whole point is to keep fighting, keep the fight going, rather than actually finding solutions. And that has kind of been baked in. And so what we saw last evening at the State of the State was that on full display. I mean, both the governor's presentation, her speech, and the Republican reaction to it, I found largely performative and very, I mean, I don't think anybody looked good out of that. It was cringeworthy, frankly. I mean, the governor baited her political opponents. They took the bait. Her speech was really weighed, I think, toward the Senate primary that she's in, rather than the issues that Maine people are facing. And she was taking credit for a whole host of things.
She did say "you're welcome" a number of times, which was interesting.
She kept saying "you're welcome," and I don't know if that was in her speech or not.
I've read the text; it was not.
Yeah,
that was
ad-libbed. I think it was ad-libbed, and she was reacting to some of the pushback that she was feeling from that side of the chamber, and the Republican side, and. It came across as really being beneath the dignity of the office, and the decorum is one thing that's, what is decorum for? It's to keep us talking with each other as adults, and like being polite is a good part of that. Common courtesy, right?
Just pretend we're civilized.
That's what decorum is in the legislative context. And we've lost a lot of that. And it's largely because people don't talk with each other, I'm thinking back on, when the federal government was shut down and people were tens of thousands of Mainers were in danger of losing their SNAP benefits. And the Senate was coming into session for a confirmation hearing. And I wrote the governor a letter and had it hand delivered to her office. And it said, please consider, why don't you bring the House in too? At least we can be planful as a state about what if 170,000 people lose SNAP benefits suddenly. Maybe we can have a conversation about it. And I saw her a couple days later because I didn't get any immediate response to the letter. And I asked her, "What? You got my letter? What do you think?" And she said, "Oh, the Republicans have no interest in dealing with that." And I said, "Well, why do you think that?" And she said, "Well, they said as much." And I said, "Have you talked with them?" And she said, "No, that's what they said in the paper." And so there's this role of leadership of actually bringing people together and having a conversation, not just inferring what the answer is going to be. And, people say things in the press that with a conversation and with some dialogue, they may come to a different conclusion. You may find some common ground. But again, finding the common ground doesn't seem to be the point anymore. And that's lost in today's politics.
I'm curious whether or not you think that some of the drift you've seen on the sort of partisan nature of the reactions of everybody out there these days, how much of it is driven by the politics of I just want to win, I want to acquire power, and this is our path to do that, is to kind of torch the other side and then try to lift ourselves up and fight all the time and that kind of thing. How much of it though is tied to how people have shifted in their views on issues? I'm looking back to last night in the State of the State address. One of the key moments where it seemed like the Republicans got particularly annoyed was when she started to talk about the sort of trans athlete issue and then, connecting it to the abortion issue and suggesting that they fund, women's health care and so on and so forth. That seems to greatly offend them. And so that's, I think, the moment when some of them stood up, I believe. So my question really bakes into this, which is, that is something that a lot of people have very passionate feelings about in both directions.
Right.
And it's really hard to sit down, come together, be reasonable and civilized when you think the other side of the aisle, in whatever their opinion is absolutely insane.
There is a lot of focus on these very, these issues that are really designed to divide people. And there's a lot of focus on that. Part of it is that both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party are these sort of concatenations of various interest groups that don't necessarily fit neatly together, if you just think about the philosophy behind it. And so what do? They focus on the things that they're opposed to rather than things that they're for, because maybe there's not a lot of harmony between on those things that they're for, but there's a lot of harmony about the things they're against.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of focus on the what they're opposed to rather than what they're for. And let's face it, it's a lot easier to stir people up over things that are lightning rod issues that energize the base. And then there's the ecosystem of social media, and you just need to make sure that you win the primaries and that you get keep people in line. There's so much more of that now. So much more. You asked what the changes I've seen. One of the things is just so much more decision making made in party caucuses rather than in committees or on the floor of the legislature. I found myself
a lot of huddling.
Yes. And I came back into the Senate after this long hiatus, 16 years, during COVID. And so that was the excuse then. We were meeting at the Civic Center, and we were in caucus for hours and hours. And so it was this groupthink develops. And I would find myself going out on the Senate floor over the last 5 years, having been told one thing in a caucus setting, and going out into the session and hearing different debates, like they're talking about a completely different bill. The Democrats are saying this, the Republicans are saying that. And I'd find myself having to actually open up the iPad that we have and read through the amendments in the bill myself and drawing my own conclusions. And it's because the forum of the legislature should be to give air to varying points of view. But, because people are really busy, they can't focus on anything outside their own committees usually until it gets to the floor, and then so there's the system really is in need of change. It needs to be open. It needs to be transparent. I think.
So do you think a significant change could happen from just changing how they do their business?
Oh, yeah. And as you probably remember, I've written extensively about this. I've been trying to force, through these arcane instruments like the Rules Committee, that I prodded to meet again. They hadn't met since 2018. This is the Legislative Rules Committee. The rules themselves say that they have to meet at least annually. And they hadn't met since 2018. The Rules Committee was violating their rules. And so I prodded and pushed, and I got myself appointed to that committee, and I had a meeting of the Rules Committee that happened in July of 2024. And it was after this contentious session, a bunch of rank and file legislators, Democrats and Republicans, and lobbyists had the temerity to come and sit before this group of legislative leaders and tell them what was wrong with their leadership. And with the hope that there would be some changes, get rid of concept drafts, get rid of all this kind of vagueness and all these, and
that just caused me to twitch a little bit.
Happened.
Yeah.
Nothing happened. I had to resign from the committee because I was just frustrated with the lack of appetite to do any change whatsoever, any reform of the system. Anybody that spent any time in Augusta in the State House knows the system is deeply broken. I've had people, since I announced my candidacy, members from both sides of the aisle come up to me and say, "Thank God you're running as an independent. This system is really broken. We need change." Well, these are people who've been successful in the system. They can't change it. So we've gotten to a point where I think it's going to take some robust executive leadership to fix this.
Well, you mentioned leadership and how important it is. I mean, this is a place for your opinions, not mine, but if you'll forgive me for a minute. One of the biggest criticisms I have over the last 8 years of Jana Mills' tenure is that I actually was weirdly kind of hopeful when she got elected. If you can characterize my feelings in 2019, like I obviously didn't support her campaign, and I wasn't really all that enthusiastic about it, but she did campaign like she wanted to work across the aisle. She wanted to be sort of a moderate Democrat. She wanted to kind of collaborate. And there were some early indications when we were sitting down with some of her commissioners that we might be able to work together. And it seems like that was all fool's gold. It was a bit of a mirage in the desert. And since, especially COVID, there's really no attempt at all to work with anybody on the other side. You mentioned sort of not calling the Republicans to ask them about a specific issue that you could work together on. I certainly know that's the case with the budget.
Yes.
For multiple times in a row, and supplemental budgets. It's ramming through sort of what I can get votes for, and it's not even taking your viewpoint into consideration. And it just festers this frustration and anger, and it just makes it more likely that they will oppose you and be, oppositional and everything else.
Yes. It needn't be that way. I mean, I think people at the State House have been frustrated by the governor's management of her role because she comes in hot late on some issues, and people work on these issues and work with interest groups, work with the advocates, work with each other in committees, trying to perfect their bills that they husbanding through the system. And then too often she comes in very late. And, I learned from that. I don't mean to sit here and criticize her, but, I've had the advantage of watching Governor McKernan. I've watched Governor King, as a legislator. I've served with Governor Baldacci briefly, served with Governor Mills. And leadership does matter, and I've learned things from each of them. And one of the things I think is really important at this moment is being inclusive and being available. That doesn't mean you have to take hard positions, but you should let people working on issues know where you're coming from and be collaboratively involved where it's important to do so. And I've seen a lot of examples of that recently. There was a couple of, what was it, last year, I guess, the years go together, but I served on the Appropriations Committee, And we were meeting, at the end of session, you usually run the table, you have the appropriations table and
right. It's a mad dash. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's a bad system, but I put forward, I should say the committee put forward a bunch of bills to bring upstairs and get finally enacted by the Senate and go to the governor's desk. And the committee did that work. And then the day that the bills were enacted was the veto day. And she didn't even want to take the bill. So we enacted 35 bills off from the appropriations table. She refused to even receive them in her office until the attorney general told her, no, you actually have to receive the actual bills. Then you can do with them as you will. It took her a whole weekend to get to that point because she was upset that the bills weren't properly before because they'd been enacted on veto day. Mm-hmm. And so a bunch of those bills, and one of which I put a bunch of those bills back in to sponsor immediately. One of which she said, well, if it came to me in January, I would sign it, was the sexual assault inventory and tracking system bill. And so I resubmitted that bill. It still hasn't been enacted. We're still the only state in the nation that doesn't have an inventory and tracking system for rape kits, forensic assault kits for victims. And the bill's sitting on the appropriations table awaiting action. And there's no need for the delay for things like that. There's a lot of bipartisan agreement. And unfortunately, leadership does matter. We need to focus on the substance of what we're trying to do rather than the battle for who's going to get credit and the power struggles and the petty partisanship, which too much rules the day in Augusta.
So before we get into some of the more meatier policy questions I have for you, I guess just to make sure that I fully understand your decision to ultimately go independent. I understand everything you're saying about sort of the party system being broken, and totally agree with it, by the way. It is fundamentally broken. It's to me, it's like one of those things that could be best described like democracy as, the worst system except for all the others. Like, it's what we got, but it's terrible. But in any event, I'm curious, you came up as a Republican, were a Republican state Senate president, you were the chair of the Maine Republican Party, and then returned to the legislature as a Republican, and you've made the decision now to run as an independent. Is it because you think that it's like logistically not possible as a Republican to govern in the way that you want to, and that, sort of collaborating in the manner in which you want to doesn't really work if you have picked a team? Or is it because of your view of what the Republican Party is and has, sort of shifted into? You alluded to like this 30, 40-year cycle. That's political realignments, and we're in one right now, obviously.
We are, definitely. That's apparent.
I always love describing it as people who used to be in the same room like blink, and then they notice that they're in a different room now. And that's kind of what's happening, is that that's
and they usually
reshuffling the deck chairs.
And it usually happens as like punctuated equilibrium, a lot of rapid change
over
a short period of time. Yeah, no, my candidacy is probably an indictment of both parties, or better yet, the party system overall as it's grown to be, which is, listen, I became a Republican because when I came of age, Ronald Reagan had just been elected president. And he was optimistic. He was upbeat. He talked about the future of our country and the future, the potentiality. And we just had the presidency of Jimmy Carter, who was a nice man, but just seemed rudderless about the malaise and just all of the failed policies. And so, like many people, I respond to optimism, particularly at a young age. You want to look at the world in a way that is full of opportunity. And so, I've been a happy Republican for all my adult life, and tried to work within the system as I saw flaws with it. And when I was elected afresh to the Senate after the break in 2020, I told all my constituents, I went to Republican meetings, I said, I just want you to know that the very last thing I'm going to think about, if you elect me, is party politics. And I've gone back to them over the last 5 years. They put me on the hot seat on a bunch of issues where I didn't agree with party orthodoxy, but I made myself available. I answered their questions. I told them why I did, and I reminded them again. And like, if you want somebody who's going to think party first, I'm not your person, and that's okay because it's your choice, not mine. And I've just tried to do things differently. I've been voting very independently, as I know you will appreciate, or at least have seen over the last 5 years on a host of issues. I try to draw my own conclusions. I put the Bangor Daily News did a study a couple of years back where it was interesting, a longitudinal study. They looked back 10 years and looked at the degree to which each member of the legislature votes with a majority of their caucus on roll calls. And I was the most likely not to vote with the majority of my caucus, but I was still at like 22% of the time I wouldn't vote. So 78% of the time I voted with the majority of the caucus. But the average, for the average legislator in that year, it was 3%. 3%.
3% that they were going against their own caucus.
Correct.
Yeah.
But 10 years prior, the average was closer to 10%. So I don't know if I've changed my approach so much as the system has sort of changed to be much more partisan and demand an orthodoxy. To answer your question, I have my issues with the Republican Party. I have my issues with President Trump's leadership. I've been vocal about both. But my candidacy is to your first point, which is I'm running as an independent because I want to govern as an independent, which means a big table, inclusiveness, collaboration, compromise, making decisions when we need to, but making sure people's voices are heard. There are so many people who feel disenfranchised today because their voices aren't even heard. They feel like their opinions don't matter. They feel intimidated from participating in politics. 35 years ago, politics was partly social. I remember the business community locally would come out and they'd hold parties, and it was for candidates, and it was convivial almost at times. We've gone a long way from that these days. I haven't been to lots of happy political meetings recently.
No one has.
So, and that's a
But
loss.
you kind of saw this on the front lines a little bit. I mean,
Yeah.
you were serving as party chair during the
Yes.
second term of the LePage years.
Yeah.
So a lot of the populist shift and what kind of has happened within the party, and of course on the other side too, the progressive side, is something you saw, with your own two eyes as it was unfolding.
One thing I've learned about myself during this period of last many years is that I look to fix things that I see as broken. And I credit Paul LePage actually with the same kind of impetus. And, there are people that look at systems and like, this needs to be better. And I looked at the Republican Party and Governor LePage called me up and said, like, would you fix this because it's not working? And so I was drawn to that.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but that is a very humble way of putting it. I remember that period, and you're talking after there was like insurrections inside the Republican Party, and platforms were being tossed out, and people were taking over meetings, and they were having a very difficult time unifying in some way. And I do remember, I will give you a lot of credit for this, when you came in as party chair, a lot of that kind of calmed down. It kind of quieted, they were looking for competence and some way of all being on the same page. And I think that kind of happened for
in all the leadership positions I've had, I find that the most important thing is to find the mission and making sure people align around the mission and know that they're working in alignment with others. That doesn't mean that you tell people how to do their jobs. It means that they understand where everybody's trying to move. And most people are competent. If they're involved, they care by definition. And so you've got that going for you. So whether it's in politics or business, I've tried to do that. And so, I felt like I could reform the Republican Party when I got elected in 2020. I wanted to model a different sort of approach that was less, was more collaborative and worked across the aisle on key issues. And I did that, and we've had some success. But I came to the conclusion during this journey, particularly over the last 5 years, that the parties are a big part of the problem. And if we're going to move the state to where we want to move the state, and we all love this state, we need a different kind of leadership. And then I look back at Angus King when he was governor. I thought about Jim Longley when he was governor. And from time to time in Maine, Maine people turned to an independent alternative. And it was at times like this. It was like right after Watergate that Jim Longley was elected. People were unhappy with partisan politics. Angus King was right after the Ross Perot phenomenon, and in 1994, people were really unhappy, feeling like the power structures that exist throughout society, not just in government, but in corporations and all the big institutions weren't really serving their purposes anymore. And so they looked at a different kind of leadership. And I think the time is now for that here again in Maine.
So let's actually get into some of the policy stuff,
Sure.
because that's usually what I like to reserve for this conversation. You become governor, and starting in 2027, you are going to have a lot of things to fix in my book. There's lots of, if you're tracking how Maine's doing, I think that you could name any particular category, and I'm not very happy with where we've been going in a lot of ways. What is your one or two biggest priorities, the things that are most broken, that require your most attention, that you're going to have to focus most of your time on when you come right in the door?
Yeah, there are some, there's a bunch of issues, and some of them are long-term and some of them are short-term. Overarching all of them is needing to change the way we operate together. We spent a lot of time on that, and I have specific ideas about the ways to bring people together in the budgeting process, in collaboration and all of that, and making sure we have those conversations, because that affects all of these. But clearly we have a problem with the affordability of Maine, and that, to translate that very easily, it's housing costs are out of sight. People can't get childcare. Energy costs are very much out of line with regional norms. Our schools are challenged to actually bring kids along. We used to be, the top quintile of states. Now we're in the bottom quintile when you're looking at that critical formative years when kids need to learn how to do math and read. And there's big majorities of kids that don't have numeracy at fourth grade, don't have literacy at fourth grade at the levels they need to. So, and these are not easy issues to deal with. They're complex, and there aren't simple solutions, which is why I think bumper sticker kind of answers aren't going to get us there. But they are the issues we need to focus on out of the gate. Critically, the first thing a governor has to do, appoint the leadership team, but also pass a budget or get a budget proposed
very quickly.
An incoming governor has an extra month, but basically in February, the month after I will be sworn in, I need to put forward a budget. In a moment of weakness a couple of years ago, I took the invitation of serving again on the Appropriations Committee, which I hadn't served on for 25 years. And talk about a shift. The night and day, the way we used to do things in the Appropriations Committee. And now, 90% or more of the budget is on autopilot. People wonder why 65% increase in the cost of government over the last 5 years. 90% plus of the budget isn't even looked at. It doesn't even have a public hearing. And why? Because of the broken nature of our politics. The majority party feels like they have to pass the budget by March 31st, so they then do the unholy act of shutting down the state government, restarting it the next day because, of course, we haven't finished our work, as a special session so that the budget can take effect on a majority vote on July 1st. What's the casualty of that? Any sort of transparency over what is actually working and not working in state government. As I said, it was like $5.5 billion of fiscal year 2027 didn't really have a public hearing. What did get a public hearing? About $300 million of new stuff, new initiatives. The governor sends in her heads of agencies and departments, and they just present on the new spending initiatives ad nauseum, an hour and a half of time. And then members of the public, advocates, get 2 or 3 minutes each to come and talk. But we haven't even looked at the most of state government in that time. as a newly elected governor, I'm going to have to do all that in a hurry between the election day and the day I have to present a budget. But I'm also going to rely on the legislature and actually demand that the legislature do its job as a sort of board of directors for state government of going through that budget. Because the legislature has found it kind of convenient that they don't have the time to do that work. And I think I'm going to demand of them that they do it. So instead of having my commissioners show up the day of the public hearing and go on for 90 minutes and suck all the oxygen out of the room, I will ask them to a week prior give a written testimony and make themselves available for questions at the public hearing, and then ask the legislature to thoroughly review the entire budget and go back to a consensus budget where all parties have a voice and a vote, and give that full 5.5 months of review that we need to do in order to get a budget which is responsive to people, is transparent, is accountable, and is actually going to work. Because we're going to have to dig into the guts of it and start looking at programs and say, what isn't working so well? What's outlived its usefulness? All of these things is not being done now.
It ultimately sources, though, to you, the governor, to make those proposals that they at least initially react to. Is when you construct that, I mean, I'm not one to suggest that you just come up with an arbitrary number for increases or cuts or anything like that, but do you have a goal with it? I mean, is it your suspicion that there is a great deal of bloat in that budget? Is it mostly in the right zone and you have to sort of tinker on the edges of it? Is it something where you think there needs to be increases in investments? I'm curious what you're going to tell those commissioners when you walk in the door. You got to do this.
The first thing is we need to look at the operation of state government, and we need to do things better, faster, and smarter. And no doubt, listen, out on the campaign trail, I hear horror story after horror story about all the time it takes to get an answer from government. Most people in business just want an answer. They can live with whatever the answer is, but when it takes 6 to 9 months for a state agency to give them an answer on a project, that's completely unworkable for them. And so getting speed is critical. And that also has the benefit of saving money and creating some predictability. So that's the first thing I will do is let's be faster and smarter and better at everything we do. But also look at what's working, see what actually has, objective measures of success that are data driven, that we can say, this program is really working. Because look, we have a mental health system which is broken, and that may need some investment. We need some new approaches there. But we also need to look at all the other areas of spending in state government that, all this money, it's like phenomenal amounts of money. And you have been highlighting this in your work at the Maine Policy Institute, which I appreciate. No bid contracts. I mean, hundreds of millions of dollars to vendors who seem to be politically connected without review. This administration is awarding an extension of the Juniper Ridge management contract for the state's landfill at Juniper Ridge to Casella to extend their existing contract, which was no bid during the Baldacci administration. It doesn't end until 2032. They want to extend it to 2040 without a bid, on a no bid basis. We have a solid waste system. This is one example, a solid waste system that's costing municipal property taxpayers buckets of money in tipping fees. The people doing the hauling are often the same, often units of Casella who are also, managing the state's system. I've asked for numbers on that to see what kind of accountabilities we have, to see if the taxpayers are really getting a good deal. Can't get the information. It's behind a cloak. So we need to unmask a lot of, and this is one example. I mean, you've given air to a lot of other ones where people are getting preferred vendors are getting no bid arrangements on a whole host of things. And are they actually delivering the goods? What are the measurements for success? The taxpayers are really finding that there's a lot of lack of transparency, a lot of lack of accountability, and they're demanding more. So I think we owe it to them to give them full transparency. What is in the public's interest with these? And I'm not saying that sometimes a no-bid contract isn't right, but it needs to be done the right way, which means specifying the terms, explaining why it's a no-bid situation. There's far too much of it going on now.
Well, you mentioned transparency too, and that's the other element of this, is that it was very hard to find that information because the public transparency laws in Maine are extraordinarily weak. And it's easy to retreat into the partisan buckets and say that it's like this because it's a blue state or whatever. But like Minnesota has much better ones. Maryland has much better ones. And, red states that are just controlled entirely by Republicans have much better ones.
Yes.
There's something fundamentally broken about Maine specifically that has nothing to do with that, which prevents you as a lawmaker or me as an ordinary citizen trying to find out very basic information about where some of this money flows. And you're seeing, obviously, this is not a surprise, but nationally you're having all these scandals over nonprofits and who's getting what contracts and all that stuff going on at the same time. It's kind of a cousin of the same issue. There's a lot of money involved and it's going a lot of places and nobody seems to be able to track it appropriately without a great deal of work.
This is a source of frustration for a lot of ordinary citizens on not only state spending, but on, just we heard all of the recent controversy around the charitable gifts around the
the Lewiston Shooting Fund.
The Lewiston Shooting Fund, but that's the private sector, if you will. That's separate from state government. State government should be a model.
Well, sort of, but the Mills administration was involved in trying to set up the Maine Community Foundation to be able to be the vehicle through which those were organized. And that's one of the interesting things that I'd be curious to get your thoughts on is these sort of weird intersections that are not like legally defined, but obviously being in a position in the governor's mansion provides you like a position of leadership, which would allow you to facilitate stuff like that sometimes.
Exactly. One of the benefits of being an independent governor is that all those things go away. I'm not beholden to anybody but the people of Maine, and I will not be part of a Democratic support system or a Republican support system. People just want systems that work and deliver the goods for them, and they want some confidence that imperfections there will be, but that these programs exist for them and they're being fairly administered and there's accountability and transparency behind them so that people can do the work of checking what is happening, where's the money going, who's benefiting, and what is actually being accomplished in the public interest. I'm very frustrated. You hear these reports about tens of millions of dollars going, but at the same time, the state DHHS isn't paying providers who are providing public goods. I had to put a bill in the legislature because DHHS, notwithstanding $1 billion cash balance, this is on top of the rainy day fund, this is just the cash balance, aren't paying vendors. The Shalom House in Portland had to wait on $2.5 million payment for 3 months. What do? They went to a bank, at 7.5% interest. Vendors, people doing good work on the public's behalf, are spending hundreds of thousands of dollars in bank fees and interest payments because the state government can't get its act together to pay legitimate contractors on time. So you have this system which is not working at all. And it needs to be broken apart, exposed to public view, and rebuilt around basic systems of accountability and transparency.
You mentioned the cost of living as being one of the biggest things. And the funny thing about that statement is that that's like 9 things, right? It's housing, it's food, it's cost of even getting a car, let alone heating your home or anything like that. I've had some previous conversations with some of the other folks that are running, and we've had some, I think, interesting dialogues about how you actually try to fix that in a practical way. Because so much of it is actually not state policy. I mean, a lot of it is.
Correct.
But you look at what's happening in the city of Portland, for instance, and why they don't build. Mostly it's municipal policy. And you're starting to see even them now, the city council's sponsoring some studies about whether or not their inclusionary zoning is working properly and is something that they should continue doing and all that. But you know, as the governor, that if you're going to fix the cost of housing in Maine, very key places like the city of Portland, South Portland, Bangor, you name it, Lewiston, are going to have to get it right.
Yes.
And how do you facilitate pushing them out the door the right way, like encouraging them to do the right things?
And the same thing's true in our education system, which is, managed at the local level. But the governor in Maine has a very strong leadership role. It involves the bully pulpit, it involves moral leadership, and there's a lot of hard power with the governor, but there's a lot of soft power too.
But at least with education, you have money.
That's true.
You have strings that you can attach to. I'm giving your school district.
Well, and I read your report on housing and what's broken with it, and actually raised it yesterday at a work session to ask Maine State Housing about their reaction to some of the things. And by the way, they said they agreed with all of your conclusions in your report about the nature of this. Is very much, there's some things at the state level, and those we should fix. Like DEP. Let's do permit by rule on a lot of these subdivisions.
Those things are layups. Those should just
Loopsy. I mean, the Land Use Planning Commission has unnecessary delays of months for projects, right? Those are in the unorganized territories. There are some areas that the state should first focus on, and I will focus on those immediate levers that the governor has to get government to work better, faster, smarter. Partly, also the benefit is to then go to the towns and cities and say, we're doing this, you need to do this too. Because there's so much sluggish work being done. There is some NIMBYism. There's a lot of slowing down projects just because people are afraid of the communities, and we need to break down these obstacles. Many of them are regulatory red tape in order to get particularly housing solved. It's a huge driver. Very happy that that there's been some bipartisan movement on that. I actually asked to serve on the Housing and Economic Development Committee this session because I saw there was an opportunity. The Republicans, they generally are opposed to subsidies for affordable housing. The Democrats have been loath to get rid of some of these regulations, but some of that's cracked open and people are having a conversation about that. And we've been passing a few bills, a lot more to do. But I see that as the problem is so severe that people are looking for bolder solutions and finding some common ground on that. But yes, it's
but when you see things that are just almost suicidal in terms of decision making, the building problem in Portland, if you've read the report, obviously, but it's really cost associated. Like if you're a developer and you want to do a project, it is not financially feasible, or it's not beneficial to you, to do it, at least in Portland. Maybe you do it in Scarborough, or maybe you do it in Westbrook or Wyndham or something like that, but you don't do it in
People
Portland.
pick their jurisdictions about where they do projects because of local zoning, local regulation.
Yeah, but oftentimes that means that they're smaller projects and we don't get what we need to get there. And it's all tied to, I just believe something that doesn't have much economic backing. Like there's just really no good economic literature that says things like rent control and inclusionary zoning and minimum lot sizes and height restrictions and all of those things work.
No, in fact,
they do the opposite.
They do the opposite. I mean, people don't like sprawl. They want open spaces. And yet minimum lot sizes push, and some of these other things you mentioned, push development, push housing farther away from service centers and places where people can live, enjoy life, and maybe be closer to what they want in terms of services. And it creates sprawl. And it's a lot of these policies may be well-intended, but they really need to be reviewed because building denser homes, it saves money. I mean, it's one of the clear way on a market basis you can save money in building a house. You use less land and you have shared utility infrastructure, right? And if you can do that, you can actually save money in the building of the home, let alone that, of course, because of our aging population, particularly the workforce who in the trades, it's hard to find people. The costs are going through the roof on that basis alone. There's a lot of area here to work on. One thing I've been focused on, because I used to work in the industry years ago, is manufactured housing. In Oxford, Maine, we used to employ 1,200 people in the manufactured housing industry. We had 5 manufacturing plants that built mobile and modular homes for Maine, the rest of New England, into New York. It was a great industry cluster there. There were hauling crews, setup crews. There were a bunch of ancillary businesses. And with the financial recession in 2009-10, that industry was wiped out. We lost all the plants except for one, KBS Homes in South Paris. But two of those factories are still available to get going again to make factory-built homes in Maine. And so I've been trying to resuscitate that industry. Now, as a legislator, what can you do about it, right? Because this is the private sector. And you wonder, why is KBS the only one when there's so much demand for housing, right? And it's not only in Maine, but in the rest of New England. And it's regulation. KBS is only at 60% of capacity right now. They have another plant, the old Kaiser factory, in which they own and is mothballed, and they could put to work. So I put a bill in that's modeled on a bill that was passed successfully in Colorado that's working very well to jumpstart their factory-built housing businesses again with temporary financial assistance to get that industry moving again. This year, after 3 years, they're going to be producing 3,000 houses a year off that program. Coloradans building houses for other Coloradans. They're doing it in rural Colorado and building houses largely going to the more developed parts of Colorado. That is part of the solution set. Let's get manufactured housing back going. But there's a lot of pushback on manufactured housing because a lot of people have in their mind, these are the old trailer homes, right? And we need to move past that. There are so many creative people doing work with factory-built housing. Carol Wilbur here in Yarmouth has got a project going using modular housing. And she had a lot of pushback. And then she came to the meetings with the elevations and the drawings. And people were like, oh, those are like really nice, attractive looking homes. Yeah. Yes, they are. They just happen to be built in a factory in Oxford, Maine. And so I think we need to get past a lot of these inhibitions to solving this housing process, housing problem, this crisis that we have. And it involves a mental shift. It also involves some regulatory changes. It involves maybe a little stimulus here and there. But it's a multi-pronged approach. No one solution is going to get us there. But we all need to have an intentionality of how can we actually build more houses? Mm-hmm. Rather than focusing on why we shouldn't in a given place.
This is a priority. We are going to talk about this, right?
We are going to. We can solve this problem. We can. Yeah. It's going to take some time. And, the governor last night made a proposal. I'll take a look at it. But, throwing more money at this is not going to solve it. Unlocking the private sector is the solution to this because we cannot subsidize our way to 80,000 more houses. I mean, it just doesn't work. We need to break down the other inhibitions that are causing the private sector not to work in this area.
Yeah, I also don't believe it, too. I know Gavin Newsom came to office 8 years ago in California saying that, I think they had like a 3 million house shortage in California, so it was pretty significant. A little better, a little worse than 80,000, but they had the same kind of idea. It's like basically we're going to try to, here and there we'll lighten some regulations or whatever, but we're really going to invest in a lot of things that make, housing more affordable for people in low income housing and whatnot. And it's actually gotten worse over that tenure of time. I just don't think that's what fixes it.
The first thing that we need to focus on in state government, and the first thing I will focus on, are those known bottlenecks, right? The things that are slowing things down, because that is a lever that we can move. And just let's do that. And Maine State Housing, they good people doing good work, but they have a historic credit program there. They have 5 underwriters, and they have a big backlog. Well, why wouldn't we ask them? And again, they're a quasi-state agency. The governor only appoints the board members. They can't tell them what to do, but there's some moral power there. Why don't we ask them? Why don't you outsource your underwriting for those parts of the historic credit to the banks that are also doing underwriting? Just train them up, have them do it. They take the fee for that part of the underwriting, relieve the backlog, get answers quicker, move projects along faster.
The other one that comes top of mind too when we have this conversation is the cost of energy.
Yeah.
They're kind of linked. Obviously, you have a house, you got to heat it, but it's not just residential. I mean, it's businesses, it's everything. And we're, depending on what metric you're tracking, we're I think third from the bottom in overall energy prices, and we were certainly number one for increase in energy prices over the course of the last calendar year. That's shocking. It's painful, and you can't open your bill anymore without seeing an increase on it. It's almost routine at this point. What does the government do about that? Because you will not be surprised if I tell you that, a lot of the culprit in my mind is actually the things that the government is adding onto the price of energy for cost.
That is part
along
of it.
the way.
That is part of it. And, I wasn't in the legislature when in 2019 they voted for the expansion of net energy billing, which left a lot of what's called stranded costs, which are really the cost of public policy decisions onto the ratepayer. And that program, was designed to stimulate solar fields in Maine. And as we can see, if you drive around Maine, it's been wildly successful. And in fact, 5 times the amount of solar fields have been built in Maine under that program than was anticipated when they passed it. So it's been overbuilt. And why? Because it was tremendously lucrative to the developers. And 85% of these developments, these solar developments, are projects that of out-of-state, Wall Street, private hedge funds. So, and who's paying the bill? The ratepayers, and particularly disproportionately small manufacturers, who we want to encourage in Maine, not only because they're providing good value-adding jobs, we're also trying to encourage them to electrify. And what a disincentive when you're telling these folks, oh, you have to subsidize all of these out-of-state developers with your profits, and you have to pay the higher rates, and we also want you to electrify. It's an impossible situation. And this is, last session I put a bill in because it's sort of a catch-22. You pass a law at the state level, and business people take their hard-earned money and invest under the rules of that law. And you can't just like a few years later say, oh, we're changing the rules, because that sends a horrible message to businesses and people wanting to invest in Maine, that if they're at all subject to the whim of the legislature, the rules may change midstream. So we couldn't just scuttle the program, and a lot of Republicans just want to get rid of the whole thing. But that's not a good message to send. You got to respect the investment process and the rule of law. But then there were people that just was turning a blind eye to it. So I put a bill
Like
in.
it's not a problem at all.
Right.
Yeah.
And I'm like, if I were governor at that time, what would I have done? There's about 13 of the major developers. I would have called them into the cabinet room and said, like, guys, you benefited from this very lucrative program, and I'm grateful for you to do that and invest in Maine. But it's not sustainable. It's not sustainable financially for the businesses and the residents of this state who are paying the bill, and it's not sustainable politically. So we're going to make some changes. Here's my proposal. React to it. And ultimately, a version of that approach passed, not with gubernatorial leadership, but with leadership by the public advocate and others who, and I put a bill in the legislature to do that, basically to cut the benefit in half to like 12 cents a kilowatt hour. And as expected, both sides like pilloried the idea, but they also said, thank you for bringing it forward, because somebody needed to break this impasse. And so that was part of helping break the impasse in the committee and getting the public advocate and others to like work on a detailed proposal, which is reducing some of that stranded cost. It was $2 billion. It's going to relieve some of that, but not a lot, but it's going to, it scale back the program.
But if you snapped your fingers and you got rid of it, that would represent a significant cost savings to a consumer, yes. Right? So owing to what you're saying about the logistical challenges of doing that with the message you're sending to the business community and whatnot, do you not taper it down maybe? Like maybe the
yes.
goal is to eliminate it over X number of years.
Right.
a small number of years, and you have that meeting with them and you say, here is the new idea, and it's still going to be there. We're slowly like winding it down. Eventually it's going to be gone. And then ratepayers won't have this on their
It's gone in 20
bill.
years anyway. But and what they did does do that to some extent. And I supported that reform. Does it go far enough? No, but it was a step in the right direction. I think generally about energy, there's a lot of ideology around energy. And I think we need to temper that with practicality. I mean, we can't just rush to these goals that are really not attainable, for clean energy standards and all. And, it's easy for legislators and the governor to say, 20 years from now, this is the reality, and that's the goal, and we're going to enact it into law. Well, what does that mean for policymakers 8, 10 years? Your successors, right? You're really putting handcuffs on them. And I think we need to have a lot of humility about doing that and making decisions for the future that we don't have any responsibility or accountability for in today's world. What that means is let's be open to energy solutions. Let's make sure that we don't put all our eggs in one or two baskets. I think that we need to examine all things, small modular reactors. There's projects going on nearby in Canada. There's probably one in New Brunswick that's going to be built. There's one being built in Ontario. Let's see what those, there's a proposal perhaps to do one at Loring. They're small. I'm told
that one's tied to a data center or something like that, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, there could be, but it's a part of this conversation. I talked with a developer and he's like, yeah, I need to use 300 acres at Loring to do this. There's plenty of acreage there. So that could be part of that.
I brought that up only because they're like linked, the AI revolution and all the data requirements and how much processing power is required. It sucks power desperately. And so they're starting to see these very odd and unexpected experimentations with reactivating nuclear power plants and maybe looking into small modular nuclear reactors just because of the power demands.
Right. And I'm not rushing to any one solution, but I think we need to put everything on the table. I mean, we have to have a real conversation about this. These SMRs are not like Maine Yankee. They're completely different. They're basically what is operating nuclear submarines and nuclear aircraft carriers all over the world. So, and then, renewables need to be part of it. I think the wind programs, where they benefit Maine, is a very important part of the mix, including offshore wind where it makes sense. I think the solar is part of the landscape now, obviously, and that's going to be part of the mix. Fossil fuels are going to be part of the mix for quite a while. And I think the state has not used its negotiating power very well. We let this corridor come through our woodland here, which is just up and going. And interestingly, they
technically finished it, didn't they?
It is, and they're sending power. But this past weekend, they shut the power supply off. Why? Because they needed it in Quebec. So, which they can do. And the fellow up there was saying, well, if you wanted to pay, if you wanted to guarantee it, you would have to pay more, and you chose not to. So, okay. So, but, we didn't negotiate that very well. I opposed that project for a number of reasons. And one was it was just a bad deal for Maine. We didn't get enough for it. The governor had a chance to renegotiate that when the people of Maine got together 80,000 signatures to put it on the ballot. And instead of saying, like, guys, if you want this to go forward, you're going to need to sweeten the deal for Maine people, she just leaned into the existing deal. And so I look at these missed opportunities around energy, around a bunch of other issues that I think the governor really needs to lead on and lean into and be more involved in.
Would you agree that the energy story of Maine and why it's sort of gotten off the rails a little bit is due largely to the goals being maybe misaligned with where they should be, at least in my book? I mean, if I'm governor, which I will never be, I will never run for your job. God love you for trying. But if you made me one, I think the first thing that I would say to any anybody who's involved in the energy picture in the state would be that the goal is that we lower costs for Mainers, like that they can afford the ability to heat their homes, and the businesses actually might find Maine attractive because they know they're not going to be sitting there with one of the most expensive bills in the country if they have a very high power demand type of business, a factory, that kind of thing. It seems like cost was like lowest on the totem pole to the consumer, was the lowest priority that we had. We had climate goals, and we had sort of like source goals and the renewable portfolio standard and whatnot. And that was not at all tied to what I'm going to pay when I get my bill.
I agree that needs to be foundational to the analysis of what the mix should be. And we cannot, again, be overly reliant on one cheap source of power now and build an infrastructure for the next decades around one solution set, because that puts us in a vulnerable position too. I mean, we should never do that. I think we need to be much more creative working regionally on this issue as well with our neighboring states, because there's Maine, needs to get to its own reliability, it needs to be self-reliant in energy. And one of the things I will do as governor is make sure that Maine is not put in a position where we're dependent on others. We can have working relationships with our neighbors. We can be part of ISO New England in this case. We can work with the Canadians. But we need to make sure that Maine is being looked out for, Maine people, not only today, but 10, 20 years from now. Politics, as you know, doesn't often look 10 or 20 years from now.
Is it ever?
we need to start thinking that way, because we're bankrupting our kids and our grandkids with the decisions we're making today.
We're starting to come to the time when we'll be wrapping up here, but I did want to at least get one more kind of major issue in before I let you go. And you had mentioned, rewinding a bit, the issue of education and where we used to be and where we are today. I know we talked a little bit about that also when we were chatting about the state address, but that one's very concerning to me. I have a bunch of kids, obviously, and I graduated high school in 1999, which, if I'm not mistaken, was literally the top of the peak for how we performed. I think it was somewhere like 97 to 99, 2001, somewhere in that window. We were consistently, in reading especially, number one in the country. That's amazing, but we're definitely not that now. And I see the work my kids come home with. I hear what they talk about every day. I got a lot of concerns about the curriculum just not really asking much out of them and them not really learning the things that they need to. And we go to one of the best schools, public schools at least, in the state. Yeah. That's one of the reasons I moved here to this particular town. So I guess to back up, what exactly went wrong along the way? And if you think there's a few things that can be done to fix it, what are those things?
Yeah, it's I also graduated from Yarmouth High School here back in 1981, and it was great. And it was a very well-funded school because the Wyman Station on Cousins Island paid 97% of the property tax.
That was a nice little deal they had, wasn't it?
So
property taxes in town have changed since that.
But we have, so money's important, but it's not everything to our education.
Well, the state has made record investments.
Yes, there seems to be, the sense of like, we just need to spend more money. And I think just like in everything else, we need more accountability in education. And we need to have like reading programs. I read recently that half of Maine's curricula for reading are not science-based. We've gotten off from the rails, and reading is the fundamental skill. You get reading right at the early age, other things will follow. Numeracy will follow, history, science, the STEM, all of that will follow if you get reading right, because then kids become curious. They become interested in the world. They have confidence that they can master things, and they, they're curious people. You have kids, I'm sure they're just like all over the place intellectually with their interests, but they need to learn how to read, and so we need to focus on reading. It's like that is the
so what Mississippi did.
Yeah, and they're now ahead of us.
Way ahead of us. They're ahead of everybody. They're on the top 10 now. Yeah.
So I think demanding accountability on reading at fourth grade level is the right focus. And if to focus on one thing, that would be it. And that means, because it's going to pay dividends for Maine for generations. Maine did not recover from COVID as fast as other states in terms of its education. I think a lot of kids were set back grievously during COVID and the approach that the state took. And I think that's regrettable.
And haven't caught back up again.
No, we haven't caught up. And, I think that the education system, which again is run by local school boards, needs to be revisited. Maybe pieces of that. I think about, I was talking with some superintendents about this issue, and they spend so much time in union negotiations because the unions are done at the local level. Maybe we should revisit that. Maybe we should.
You're reviving that statewide teacher contract thing.
Maybe we ought to do that. I think we need to think anew about this. I mean, one of the reasons we have so many superintendents and so much administration, which costs a lot of money in Maine, is because of management of unions at the local level. So,
but we also have it because everybody loves to have local control. Look, I believe in that. Like, I like local control too.
And
but
the Constitution demands
very expensive.
The Constitution demands it.
It does.
We have that to think about clearly. But we should.
I'm just flashing back to Baldacci trying to consolidate schools and how much resistance politically there was to that, and it kind of was something that I think really bit him in the rear end on the.
It is, and it's happening though. I mean, my district, SAD 17, it came together in the 1960s, and the promise was every town of the 8 would keep their elementary school. Well, here it is, 2026, and that promise has been broken. And there are 3 towns that are losing their elementary school right now. And the state has been encouraging that because they need to update and repair the school buildings and build new school buildings. And they're saying you need to consolidate in order to get the state funding. So that's happening, particularly in rural Maine. I mean, you really have a bifurcated issue here where you have some enrollments that are keeping pace or increasing in parts of Maine. Many towns in Maine are seeing their school age population just drop off the cliff.
Mm. Well, I guess the final question I would ask you as we wrap things up here is to just maybe make your final pitch to folks. I mean, obviously our audience is very broad and there's a lot of people that subscribe to us, but it's a right of center audience. A lot of folks that probably would consider themselves to be Republicans along the way. Although, I've had my statements about the Republican Party and where it is right now. Be curious about what you think will work on people who are really hardened in those positions that you talked about at the very outset of our conversation.
Sure.
Everybody has drifted into their bunkers and their silos, and you feel very rigidly a member of your tribe these days.
Right.
And it's hard to break out of that. Yeah. What would you say to those people, frankly, on either side of the aisle, I suppose, to say, hey, to come up for air, talk to Rick Bennett, come over here, stand on this side of the room, right? What would you say to them?
I would say just, hear what I have to say. Don't make a decision just because of knee-jerk adherence to a party, first and foremost. Think about this decision. You're going to have ample choices in the primary in June. Beyond that, I will be there as an alternative in the general election in November. And I offer a different kind of approach, one that is inclusive and collaborative. And I won't agree with you on everything, and that's really not the point. The point is to have a system that responds to your needs and actually gets things done. Because right now we have total paralysis, and there's a lot of finger pointing, a lot of blame game. That's what partisanship has become. But we have some wrenching issues that the state is facing going forward, and they're generational issues. We've talked about many of them. But if we're going to dive into those issues, we're going to have to listen to our neighbors. We're going to have to work together, and we're going to have to come up with common solutions. And I think everybody will acknowledge that one side doesn't have all the answers. And so we need to have that conversation to actually focus on what will get us forward to a better place.
Do you think that your success in this campaign is going to at all depend on who the Republicans and the Democrats choose in their primaries? I've had so many conversations with this, but if they go pretty extreme in either direction or whatever, obviously that opens up a lane for you a little easier.
I think the lane is open already based on the reception I'm receiving, which I can only describe as heartwarming. I just feel that, I'm not a usual independent candidate in recent years. I'm somebody that is better known for years of service. I'm somebody who combines an experience, a well-tested experience in making government work and navigating government, but also a fairly rich private sector experience of managing and turning around Maine businesses and creating jobs. And I think people look for that. They don't want just experience with government or experience, just in the private sector, because they know that there's a difference. And if we're going to get things done, the governor needs to be grounded in both those realities for people. They need to know what actually encourages investment, improves the business climate, makes people, gets businesses in a place where they can employ more people, and is mindful of the bottom lines that Maine business people are facing, and they're grievous right now. They're really challenging. At the same time, being creative about governing and finding solutions that are responsible, fiscally prudent, embedded with accountability and transparency, but are achieved through collaboration and inclusive conversations.
That's interesting. Well, Rick Bennett, state senator and longtime friend. We've known you for a very long time, Rick.
Thank you,
and
Matt.
I mean, I suppose I probably have to say that at one time long ago, you served on the board of directors for the Maine Heritage Policy Center back in the iteration of our prior name and whatnot. And that was, you mentioned to me, and when you walked into my office a long time ago, wasn't it? That was long ago. But
it's getting there, but
it's funny. You're still so young, which means that you got involved in this.
I was
pretty darn early in your life.
I was
right?
Indeed, yes. And I just encourage people to, if you love this state, get involved. I mean, it's really remarkably easy. And I just ask people, a lot of people are scared out of politics these days. They're intimidated by it. They don't want anything to do with it. One of my goals as governor is going to make politics fun again. I'm running a joyful campaign, and I think we need to bring a joyful approach back to governing, where people feel included and feel like their voice will be heard. That's so critical if we're going to continue for another 250 years as a republic. Yeah,
that is the year we're in, isn't it? 250. Well, Rick Bennett, appreciate you spending some time with us today. First of, I'm sure, many conversations, but we always love talking to you guys in depth about this stuff. I appreciate it because so much of politics today is the 30-second soundbite and all that. To sit down and actually have a conversation for an hour and a half is pretty nice. So. I'm grateful for your taking a different approach on that because it's very much needed. And I appreciate it. I think it's the same philosophy that you kind of have been talking about all day here, which is a need to inspire a little bit more rational, thoughtful, civil conversations. So I appreciate you. Thank you. Playing the game a little bit with me. So thanks a lot. So we are done and wrapped here. We'll have more candidate conversations. Pine Tree Pulse, of course, itself is going to be back on Friday. So stay tuned for that. And thanks again to Rick, and we'll see you soon.
This has been Pine Tree Pulse. Disrupting the Maine political machine, one podcast at a time. Visit MainePolicy.org to learn more, or follow the Maine Policy Institute on social media. Thanks for listening, and make sure to join us again next time.